You know what? I need to download the Mr. Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. How are you, John?
I'm doing really well, Jason. Good to see you.
I think I can see an inky sticking out above your set there.
An Inky?
Little light.
What's ah? Well,
Now, is this Mr. Rogers' neighborhood or Mr. Robinson's neighborhood there?
no, this is Mr. Rogers in Pittsburgh. We did the show with Dr. Cyril Wecht a couple weeks ago from Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
and just felt a bit of a Pittsburgh vibe. And I wanted to talk about, the word of the day, obfuscate. And it's a really important word for the kids to learn. So in today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about obfuscation and how do you recognize it and why is it necessary? So we're going to talk about that on the show today.
Yeah. It's, hiding and confusing stuff. John, there's just a little information I want to bring to everybody's attention because there's going to be a lot of people who are trying to watch us right now on the main Crowdsource the Truth channel, and they're going to be disappointed that we're not there because malicious social engineers have once again issued a strike against the Jason Goodman channel. So every time they do this, it's really this they're like chopping at me with paper cuts, petty little annoyances. And what their goal is they want to reduce the reach of these videos. They want to prevent people from knowing that you and I are doing a sponsor exclusive show that people can enjoy on subscribestar.com/IamJohnCullen, patreon.com/IamJohnCullen, and Subscribestar and Patreon/crowdsourcethetruth. It's more important right now than ever for people to become sponsors and get on to Subscribestar or Patreon, because as these social engineers continue to try to remove us from YouTube, YouTube is also introducing increasingly draconian measures that basically allow them to kind of delete people for whatever they want. And the fact that you don't have an adversarial forum where you can present evidence, YouTube basically just decides you're going off. So it's a dangerous climate for us to operate in, and for people who really want access to this information. I'm going to get a million emails telling me to go on to BitChute, telling me to go on to Rumble, telling me to go on to all these things. We're on every one of those platforms. So every time somebody tells me to go on there because that'll increase my reach, it really just emphasizes what I'm saying. People who are supporters of those platforms who don't know that our shows are available on there are demonstrating the lack of reach that those platforms have. So I also want to encourage people to subscribe to the John E. Hoover YouTube channel. We are simulcasting our shows there, but unfortunately today's episode is very probably going to reach far fewer people than it otherwise would.
Mm. Well, again, we're on the knife's edge of, I guess, what we're allowed to talk about. And, I didn't put this in the deck. I'm putting a video together on the subject this weekend that'll come out. But what we're going through, and by we, I mean, the Crowdsource the Truth family that you've put together, the investigative journalist team, and I consider Shepard Ambellis part of that team, even if he's kind of a black sheep member or whatever, but I still consider him part of the family. If you look at what we're going through, and if you look at the way that Twitter has censored the president of the United States, right? Regardless of whether you like him or not, or you like his politics, it's the president of the United States. And the fact that Twitter is censoring him, the fact that YouTube, our gracious hosts tonight, don't want us to question anything having to do with any of the dockets at the Supreme Court this week. So we're not going to talk about that. All right. Yeah. But what it's reminding me of is a period of time about 400 years ago when when Sir Isaac Newton's, and I'm going to paraphrase, Sir Isaac Newton said something about how he stood on the shoulders of giants, right? He said, if I did something, can you look up the quote from Sir Isaac Newton? Again, I didn't put this in the deck,
Sure.
but Sir Isaac Newton said something about standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And this is one of his, super famous quotes, Sir Isaac Newton. And these giants that he is talking about, I kind of look at as the original crowdsource the truth. Okay, now it took them longer. Standing on the shoulders of giants is a metaphor. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So that's the quote. It's from 1675. So who are these giants he's talking about? Well, the giants that Isaac Newton was talking about were Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo. And together, these guys formed the new science. Before Nicholas Copernicus, we thought the sun revolved around the earth. And Copernicus didn't publish this until he was on his deathbed because he knew it was going to drive everybody crazy. Galileo is born 20 years after Copernicus dies. And Copernicus is Polish, right? And Galileo is Italian, right? They're not exactly neighbors, right? Galileo, born 20 years after Copernicus dies, takes up this heliocentric philosophy.
Right.
And the thing that's sort of this ironic connection between Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton, and what was happening back then, and this was the Renaissance. This was the scientific Renaissance. The object, the thing that changed everything, was the telescope. How ironic is that? Arecibo and all the telescopes got closed. Shepard Ambellis comes on the show and says, virus? Look up.
Huh. It's a good point.
Okay.
I found that collapse of that Arecibo very weird, John. They had a drone in flight over it. How could that be a spontaneous collapse and get a drone up there the moment before it collapses?
All right. So if you guys don't know the story, the telescope was invented in Denmark, in Holland. And days later, Galileo made his own. As soon as he heard what the guy had made, and it was a 3-power telescope, Galileo makes his own telescope, points it at the moon, and starts drawing what he sees on the moon. And it's mountains and stuff there, stuff like that. But the next thing that Galileo does is he looks at Jupiter. And what he realizes is that there's moons going around Jupiter. First, he thinks they're stars. Then he realizes, oh my God, they're going around
Just
Jupiter.
from a 3x power telescope? No, his must have been much
his
more.
Was 8x. His was 8x. His was 8x. And you just pulled up a picture of it. You saw a picture. It's this long, skinny tube. I think it was made out of leather or something. And it was an 8-power telescope, and he could see the moons of Jupiter. And this was when he realized that celestial bodies don't all revolve around the Earth. And this was counter to what Aristotle said, but more importantly, it was counter to what the church said. Now today, for all intents and purposes, there's a new church. Alphabet, Twitter, Facebook. And they decide. Because what happened to Galileo? When Galileo said that the Earth is actually revolving around the sun and that those moons are revolving around Jupiter, he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. He went against the narrative. So did Copernicus.
There's still people who want to try to convince us that the Earth is flat. They come into the comments all the time.
Yeah, I don't have time for that.
So I agree.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were so advanced. And what's interesting is you look at these different characters and you look at the roles that they played, right? So Copernicus brings forth the heliocentric theory. Galileo documents it. He goes out and looks at the moons of Jupiter, makes the notes, does the data, records the locations, does all the kind of data stuff, right? Meanwhile, Johannes Kepler up in Holland or whatever, up in the Netherlands, he's saying the planets go around the sun in an elliptical motion. Now he's right, but he's so specific that Galileo's like, dude, can we just get to first base? You're talking about elliptical versus circular, right? And Kepler was right. Kepler was
I like
brilliant.
that specificity.
Yes, but we're trying to get people to first base, which is that the Earth is revolving around the sun and not vice versa. And Kepler's talking about ellipses versus circles, right? And to me, that kind of reminds. Well, I went to Bronx High School of Science. They drill this stuff into your head. So it's almost like now, this is kind of I'm kind of goofing around a little bit, but to me, Kepler is a little bit like Laura Loomer talking about, is it ISIS or is it Al Qaeda in Vegas? Right. And it's like ellipse or circle. It's helicopters. Who cares, right? I don't care if it's ISIS or Al Qaeda. We know who they are, right? It's bad guys in helicopters shooting people. And she's being specific. And I'm just trying to get people to accept the helicopters, right?
Laura's way better looking than this guy.
Well, for sure. But Laura Loomer is like our Johannes Kepler, where she's got the specificity. I'm like the guy with all the numbers and everything. Shep is the guy who brings the story to the table. And these guys were crowdsourcing science 400 years ago. In the 1600s, so what was it, 1610? What was the date? If you look, it'll give you the date that Galileo looked at Jupiter. I think it's January.
Well, this dude died in 1630.
Yeah, that's Kepler, though. And again, Kepler was brilliant, but Kepler was arguing kind of the super, super fine points that, we needed to get people to the first aspect of accepting it. And nobody wanted to hear this. Nobody wanted to hear this story. And, we talk about hubris, and we talk about a lot of these effects, right? And, again, Galileo didn't invent the telescope, but as soon as he heard about it and he heard how it was done, he made his own. And his was 8 power. The one that they had up in the Netherlands was 3. He spent the first couple of weeks looking at the moon. And then when he looks at Jupiter and he has this discovery, nobody else was looking at Jupiter with a telescope and making recordings of where those little dots were. Nobody was doing it. Similar to nobody was looking at the CDC's data, like me. Nobody was looking. Nobody was checking the math. Right? We don't see the type of analysis. If you go to my deck now and you show people let's look at a couple of the charts real quick. Why don't we see this on CNN? Why don't we see the analyses that we've been doing on the news? Why does nobody do this? Why is no one going in and saying, what is going on in Vietnam? Why is no one dead in Cambodia? Why is no one dead in Laos? That is true, right? Why? And the fact that there's less than 10 people dead in Shanghai and there's less than 10 people dead in Beijing, the WHO doesn't think that's a lie. Bill Gates doesn't think that's a lie. And there's less than 10 dead in Taiwan. And Taiwan's not China. So they're all not lying. The question is, who's lying to whom, where? And that's a hypothetical question because I don't know the answer. But according to the mapping system that I helped put together 30-something years ago, there's not 10 people dead in Beijing. And there's not 10 people dead in Shanghai. And that's according to Johns Hopkins. But the fact that the news won't talk about that is fascinating to me. Almost like they wouldn't accept what Galileo's observations were showing, were proving. It's very similar. We have the data, we have the observations, but it's very upsetting and it changes everything. Let's go to the next slide. You know, you think about how many months we've been challenging Cuomo and Whitmer and all the governors and DeWine in Ohio. And I mean, we've been comparing these cities to countries, and there's no comparison. We've got more people dead in Rhode Island than they do in Nigeria, right? I mean, this is a debacle. And yet we can't get the media, we can't get the real news, so to speak, to cover this. And so we're the conspiracy theorists that are going to get thrown off of YouTube for going to the CDC and documenting this, for talking to Dr. Cyril Wecht, Martin Luther King's coroner. So we're going to get thrown off? Huh. It just feels so similar to what Copernicus and Galileo went through. They had the goods, they had the data, they had the evidence. It didn't matter. And to think that 400 years later, the only thing that changed is it's not the Pope. It's Zuckerberg. It's Jack. And I'm not going to mention our hosts because they haven't taken all my video down yet. So thank you guys. Yeah. So thank you. But I mean, it's wrong. It's wrong. We're not. This isn't a Nazi show. We don't come here and talk Nazi stuff. We're not. This isn't violence. This isn't a show where we talk about killing kitties. What the hell do people think this is if this isn't just simply adult discourse? And the fact that we're going to introduce concepts that are new, they're different. You may not agree with it. That's okay, but it's not violent. It's not dangerous. Nothing here is violent or dangerous.
You know, to some extent, John, this stuff is driven by the community guidelines that these various social media platforms employ. But the truth of the matter is, this is coming from deliberate individuals who are going through the library of thousands of videos looking for one statement, one link to something that's shown for even a portion of a second to bring it to YouTube's attention because they're malicious. They want the show to be taken down. They don't want people to see the evidence and information that you've brought forward, the different guests and everything. And they want crowdsource the truth to go away.
But we're trying to save people's lives. This is life and death stuff. Both the Vegas shooting and this. These are life and death issues, life and death cases, where the sooner the public comes to the realization of what has actually happened, the safer the public is going to be. Right? And that's what we're talking about here in tonight's show. If you go to the next slide, let's take a look at what we've got here. Yeah. So what I keep doing is going to the CDC. And one of the things that we're going to talk about on tonight's show is the comorbidities. Because, again, the news isn't exploring comorbidities at all. Don't they matter? If we knew that every person who died of coronavirus or with coronavirus, also, let's say everybody, if everybody who died with coronavirus had also had it here, would that be relevant?
You cut out for a second, John. If they also had what?
If all the people who died of coronavirus also had another condition within the last year, everybody, would it be relevant? Would it be something we would want to talk about? If everybody who died of coronavirus purchased a Honda Accord in the last year, would it be relevant?
I would think so.
Yes, it would be relevant.
John,
so now,
Chris, real quick, Chris is with us in the comments saying his girlfriend had COVID-19 and got better. The health department called and they were specifically not interested in what she took to get well.
Yeah. No, that's not one of, I mean, they've got their
How does
list
that
of
make
things they're
sense?
interested in. Yeah. Footnotes they're not interested in. So I think I mentioned, I know a couple people now that have contracted it. But what we're going to see, if you go to the next slide with the data, the comorbidity data is important, right? If people are dying with coronavirus and something else, and there's a lot of the something else, how do we pretend that's not happening, right?
Wow, yeah. I mean,
So
it's
what
more
I'll
than half in every single one of these examples.
Correct. So it turns out that there's one comorbidity that more than 50% of every single age group has. So go to the next slide. And we'll wrap it up. I know we got to go to our patron-only hour in just a minute. But first of all, you need to understand the age groups and the deaths by age group. You need to understand that until you get to 65 years old and older, we're not into the big numbers. Okay, so go to the next slide after this one. There you go. All right, so this puts it in perspective, and this is what I want people to understand. This is the first group. These are COVID-19 deaths to date in the United States. The first group is 1 to 44 years old. Jason, you just missed the cut by a smidge. 1 to 44, 7,000 are dead. Now you go 45 to 64. Okay, this is your age group now, my age group, 43,500. Okay, it's a big number, but Dr. Fauci told us we had 80,000 dead from influenza in 2017, right? So 43,000 is less than our influenza toll in 2017. Now you go to 65 and older.
It's amazing.
You see what perspective? So perspective is important. It's important to understand how the disease is affecting different populations. This is what the president was trying to communicate, but he didn't have my charts, right? So he was trying to say that different populations seem to be more or less than immune than others. And when you look at this chart, it becomes rather clear which population is at the most risk. Right.
I tell you, John, when you see this data, it really makes you wonder why they didn't, back in March, say, listen, if you're over 65, or at some point during the 9 months. I mean, this data has been accumulating for months, and I mean, they're shutting everything down now, restaurants or whatever. It seems like an appropriate measure might be to say, look, if you're over 65, if you've had any of these other things, if you're on medication, stay home, but everybody else go to work. They're not doing that. They're just talking about masks and breathing.
I think if we have time for one more slide, people are catching on, and I think, yeah. So this is just a humdinger. All right. So these are the comorbidities for the kids, and the thing that's going on with the kids, it's driving me crazy. I know Laura Ingram's upset about this. With the schools, and the kids are having to do this remote Zoom class nonsense, and the teachers aren't showing up, and it's just a disaster. Well, if we look at the kids that have died from COVID, we see in the blue are kids that died from COVID but did not have influenza. The green are kids that died with COVID and also had influenza. Wow. And there's not that many kids to begin with, right? So 5 to 14 years old, there's only 45 kids, right? And of the 45, 40 of them had influenza. And kids that have died 1 to 4 years old, there's only about 15 or 16, and all but 1 or 2 of them had influenza. So most of these deaths have COVID and influenza. This is not important. This is not relevant. This is not true. I'm getting the data from the CDC, right? So if the data is from the CDC, where's the controversy? I'm just making it into charts. That's all I'm doing. So
Yeah.
this is the CDC's truth, so to speak, right? And when I look at this, it makes me wonder, well, golly, we're finding this out post-mortem. This is what we were talking about with Dr. Cyril Wecht. We're finding this out post-mortem. The doctors have already said we're not testing for influenza. We're not. We don't even know about it.
Yeah.
We're finding this out after the fact. Well, we've been reporting this now for 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a theory?
It's certainly backed by a lot of strong evidence. I mean, when you look at these numbers, it's hard to understand why you would close a school if children are, they've been around the same environments that adults have, stores and restaurants.
But
And
I think there's another question. Go one more slide. The question is, why are we not treating people for their co-infections?
Hmm.
If people have 2 infections and they're dying, you don't want to give them the Tamiflu or the Zofluza or the Avigan or Baloxavir or Seltamivir, whatever it is you want to give them. We shouldn't give them something. They're dying.
The label,
And nobody
people are asking, sorry to interrupt you, John. Joe is asking what the label on the y-axis is. That's the number of kids. And it only goes up to 40 because the total number dead is like 42, 41 nationwide.
Well, up to 4 years old is 46. And
Now, I
then
hate to
from
cut you
5
off,
to
John, but we are out of time. We need just a minute to make our transition over to the sponsor exclusive segment. I really do want to ask people to share this video. Social engineers are trying to reduce our reach. They don't want people to see this information. They want to fill people's heads with information from the mainstream news. They don't want debate. They can't argue with facts, so they want to shut us up. Join us in just 2 minutes on subscribestar.com/IamJohnCullen, patreon.com/IamJohnCullen, or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. We're getting into a period here where our viewer sponsors are so important. It's becoming virtually impossible to speak about this stuff in an open forum. So we'll see everybody there in just a few minutes. Thanks for watching.